Good morning, students! Welcome to Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction. I am Danica Grace Besana, your subject teacher for today. When does a disaster occur? Does the mere occurrence of strong earthquake, super typhoon, or tsunami automatically qualify as disaster? If you want to know more, let's get started. Let's have a quick review. Identify the following event that is happening in the picture. We have two sets for this. I will give you a few seconds to give your answer. Okay, let's check. What does the picture shows? In the first picture, it shows an earthquake, and on the second picture, it shows a fire. Here is another set for you to answer. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to give your answer. Okay, let's check. The third picture shows volcanic eruption, and the fourth picture shows flood. Did you get everything right? Great job! What do we need to know in this topic? Our objectives today is to explain the meaning of disaster, differentiate the risk factors underlying disaster, and describe the effects of disaster on one's life. We're going to have an activity. In Activity 1, you will read a newspaper article. Based on the details of the articles, you have to answer the following questions. Iligan City Mayor Lawrence Cruz said many people were caught by surprise when water rose 1 meter or 3 feet high in less than an hour, forcing people onto roofs. He said that most of the residents were already sleeping when floodwaters entered their homes. This is the worst flooding the city has experienced in years. He added that the National Disaster Agency said it could not estimate crop and property damages because emergency workers, including soldiers and police officers, were evacuating families and recovering casualties. Benito Ramos, head of the NDRRMC, told reporters that the residents were warned about the dangers posed by the storms days earlier, but elected not to move to safe areas. He said Mindanao was rarely visited by storms, even as 20 major storms strike the Philippines annually, with the most hitting Luzon, the largest and most populous island in the Southeast Asian archipelago. Ramos also added that it was expected to have a huge damage on agriculture since 2 of the 3 rivers that flow into the port of Iligan had overflowed. A representative from Red Cross also added that there have been casualties in the city. Among those who were killed was a popular radio commentator. Other affected areas on Mindanao included Bukidnon Province, have 47 people died, while the other 9 were killed elsewhere on the island. Let's answer some questions. Number 1. What disaster has taken place? Number 2. Was the disaster caused by natural or man-made event? Number 3. What did the disaster incur to the community? Number 4. Did the community know about the occurrence of the disaster? The answer for number 1 is flooding. The answer for number 2 is a natural disaster. The answer for number 3, damage to property, agriculture, and death. And the answer for number 4 is yes, they are warned. Did you get everything correct? Great job! Now, let's go to the second activity. You will identify whether the following event or situation is a hazard or a disaster. Write your answer on a piece of paper. Pause the video and write your answers on your paper. Okay, let's check. Did you get everything correct? Great job! You probably have gotten used to hearing news about typhoons, earthquakes, or volcanic eruptions happening every now and then. Many of us might have also experienced disasters due to one or more of these natural events that these are no longer considered as news. The occurrence of a disaster depends on the interplay between a natural phenomenon that can turn into a hazard and the vulnerability of populations exposed, or what we call exposure and vulnerability. So, what is disaster? We have two definitions here. Disaster is defined as a serious disruption of functioning of society, causing widespread human material or environmental losses, which exceed the ability of the affected people to cope using their own resources. Another one is an event, either man-made or natural, sudden or progressive, causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses. There are two types of disasters. We have natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disasters are catastrophic events with atmospheric, geological, and hydrological origins. Examples of these are drought, earthquakes, flood, hurricanes, and landslides that can cause fatalities, property damage, and social environmental disruption. While man-made disasters have an element of human intent, negligence, or error involving a failure of a man-made system, as opposed to natural disasters resulting from natural hazards. Such man-made disasters are crime, arson, civil disorder, terrorism, war, biological or chemical threat, cyber attacks, and others. We have to consider the disaster risk. Now, what is a disaster risk? Disaster risk is the probability that a community structure or geographic area is to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard on account of its nature, construction, and proximity to a hazardous area. It signifies the possibility of adverse effects in the future. It is derived from the interaction of social and environmental process, from the combination of physical hazards and the vulnerability of exposed elements. When does a hazard becomes a disaster? You recall from your earth science lesson that the Philippines hosts frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions because of its position with a ring of fire, which is the edge of the most dynamic tectonic plates. However, natural events do not automatically become hazards, much less cause disasters. A disaster happens when the probable destructive agent, the hazard, hits vulnerable populated area. A natural event like a volcanic eruption or tsunami which hits an uninhabited area does not qualify as disaster. It becomes disaster only if it hits vulnerable population and properties. In short, if there are victims. Here are some risk factors underlying disasters. Number 1, severity of exposure. The amount of exposure to the disaster is highly related to risk of future mental problems. At higher risk are those who go through the disaster themselves. Next are those in close contact with the victims. At lower risk of lasting impact are those who only had indirect exposure, such as news of the severe damage. Number 2, gender and family. Disaster recovery is more stressful when children are present in the home. Women with spouses also experience more distress during the recovery. Having a family member in the home who is extremely distressed is related to more stress for everyone. Marital stress has been found to increase after disasters. Also, conflicts between family members or lack of support in the home make it harder to recover from disasters. Number 3, age. Adults who are in the age range of 40 to 60 are likely to be more distressed after disasters. The thinking is that if one is in the age range, he or she has more demands from job and family. In general, children show more severe distress after disasters than do adults. Higher stress in the parents is related to worse recovery in children. Infants to small children and senior citizens are more vulnerable in times of disasters. Number 4. Developing countries. Globalized economic development has resulted in increased polarization between the rich and the poor on a global scale. This has increased vulnerability to disasters in some cases, whilst increasing exposure to hazards in others are more and often more valuable assets are developed in hazard-prone areas. Number 5. Low or negative social support. The support of others can be both a risk and a resilience factor. Social support can weaken after disasters. This may be due to stress and the need for the member of the support network to get on with their own lives. What we discussed are several risk factors underlying a disaster. These are severity of exposure, gender, family, age, developing countries, and number 6, low or negative social support. All of these are factors that are determinants of the degree of disaster risk. What are the effects of natural disasters on human life? Number 1, displaced populations. One of the most immediate effects of natural disasters is population displacement. When countries are ravaged by earthquakes or other powerful forces of nature like floods and super typhoons, many people have to abandon their homes and seek shelter in other regions. A large influx of refugees can disrupt accessibilities of healthcare and education, as well as food supplies and clean water. An example of this, when Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, thousands of families in Zambales and Pampanga were displaced as their communities were ravaged by lahar flow. Number 2. Health risks. Aside from the obvious immediate danger that natural disasters present, the secondary effect can be just as damaging. Severe flooding can result in stagnant water that allows breeding of waterborne bacteria and malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Dengue fever is another serious health problem caused by mosquitoes Aedes aegypti, with an emergency relief from international danger has passed. Number 3. Food scarcity. After natural disasters, food often becomes scarce. Thousands of people around the world go hungry as a result of destroyed crops and loss of agricultural supplies, whether it happens suddenly in a storm or gradually in a drought. As a result, food prices rise, reducing families' purchasing power and increasing the risk of severe malnutrition. The impacts of hunger following an earthquake, typhoon, or hurricane can be tremendous, cause lifelong damage to children's development. Number 4. Emotional aftershocks. Natural disasters can be particularly traumatic for young children. Confronted with scenes of destruction and the deaths of friends and loved ones, many children develop post-traumatic stress disorders or PTSD, a serious psychological condition resulting from extreme trauma. Left untreated, children suffering from PTSD can be prone to lasting psychological damage and emotional distress. Here are some points to remember. With zero vulnerability, even a super typhoon hitting highly populated area does not translate into a disaster. Vulnerability refers to factors such as physical, social, economic, and environmental that increases the susceptibility to the impact of hazard. Vulnerability can be reduced, for example, through an aggressive information and education campaign on storm surge hazards. And the last one, Exposure refers to people and property. When does a natural phenomenon becomes a disaster? A natural event only becomes a disaster when it impacts human life, property, or livelihood. How is disaster risk estimated? Why is measurement, quantitative or qualitative, of risk important? The overall risk is calculated by combining the probability of damage and loss to the people and the structures, the vulnerability of society, and the economy, taking into account their capability to cope with the disaster. We can measure disaster risk by analyzing trends of, for instance, previous disaster losses. These trends can help us to gauge whether disaster risk reduction is being effective. We can also estimate future losses by conducting a risk assessment. How do disasters negate the economic gains of a developing country? A country ravaged with a natural or man-made disaster might have not enough resources to repair the damages in the community. It also depends on the actual damage caused by the disaster. Depending on how much the damage, funds might be used to reallocate to different areas where it is needed. For example, what happened to our country in the surge of COVID-19 pandemic, funds are used to give assistance to the people who are displaced from work or could no longer work. The economy was affected because a lot of businesses closed down, trading became quite difficult, and people lost their jobs. It will take time to recover, and this will affect the GDP of the country. How can we apply these principles in an actual everyday scenario? Suppose you are living near the beach. A natural hazard such as a tsunami becomes a hazard if it poses a threat to people. A magnitude 6.5 earthquake is usually strong enough to generate tsunami that could be destructive to nearby coastal areas. The tsunami waves that are about to hit a beach area with people, animals, trees, and houses are considered a hazard. After the tsunami hits the populated area, it is no longer a hazard but a disaster with victims of destruction or damage all over the place. Let's summarize our thought. Will a hazard always cause a disaster? The answer is no. A hazard will only become a disaster if it hits vulnerable population and properties, or if there are victims. What are the several factors underlying disaster? These are: number 1, severity of exposure; number 2, gender; number 3, family; number 4, age; number 5, developing countries; and last, low or negative social support. These factors are determinants of the degree of disaster risk. What do you think are the effects of natural disaster on human life? There are a lot of effects a disaster might bring, but the common category are displaced population, health risk, food scarcity, and emotional aftershock. Understanding these principles will help you plan to prevent disasters. I hope that clarifies the lingering questions you had. Now that you are all set, let's have a quiz. Pause the video and write your answers on your paper. For your instruction, write the letter of your answer on a piece of paper. Time for answers! Pause the video to correct your answer. Did you get everything right? That's great! That's the end of our session. Join me again next time. If you have inquiry, questions, suggestions, or clarification, don't hesitate to message me. Until next time, this is Danica Grace Besana, your subject teacher. Let's stay home and keep safe. Bye everyone!